Yeah, our keynote speaker, Julie, she's telling from her more than 30 years experience of catching up with a hectic industry. And as far as I understood, she's going to share some tricks how to catch up with all the change. Please welcome Julie Lerman.
Thank you. And my mic is on. Oh, great. I don't have to shout. So, hello. Well, more than 30 years. Now you're going to make me even older than I already am. My gosh. So, yeah, it has been a long time. And, Dan was talking about all the new technologies that are coming along and the big problem, the challenge that they present to security. But they also present another really big problem for all of us, more stuff to learn, right? So here we go. So with my 30 plus years, yeah, I started when I was 2. I have been constantly dealing with this, right? I have been coding for all these years. So I've been dealing with changes in technology, changes in architecture, new languages, new best practices. Those change every day, right? Paradigm shifts. Shall I mention JavaScript libraries and frameworks? There's a few of those on a constant basis. And throughout this all, I've kept working at it, kept learning, kept my skills up. I've kept my street credibility, which is, that's been definitely a challenge. And another important thing is keeping my relevance. And all along, through all of these years, I have had so much fun doing it. And I can't imagine doing anything else for the next, 30 plus years, knock on wood, wherever that is. So I was really happy that they asked me to come and speak at these conferences and to the 2 conferences to be able to share some of my bag of tricks so that hopefully you can add some of these things to your own bag of tricks when you are feeling overwhelmed by new stuff to learn. So I actually had gathered and found a slide that had all these different logos of JavaScript libraries and frameworks and everything, just as an example of the overwhelming amount of stuff there is out there. And I grabbed that in the fall, and I looked at it the other day and realized it's already totally out of date because there's so many more new JavaScript libraries and frameworks out there and more things. So instead, I just thought I would share these commit strip comics that kind of make fun, like everybody thinks, it's kind of funny about all the different JavaScript frameworks. But even as you look forward to the possibility of more stuff to learn, if you look backwards, which you may not do very often, except for saying, oh my God, here we go again, right? But you probably have a lot of experience already, even if you've only been doing this for 5 years. A lot of experience with learning about new technologies and retooling and reinventing yourself maybe if you need to for your career. I've certainly been doing this. So I'm curious. This is kind of my process for learning, how I've learned a lot. And you might be familiar with some of this. First, I hear about something, right? And I'm always curious, right? Especially who here is on Twitter? Like this a never-ending stream of people saying, oh, this new thing, you have to learn it, you should use this, all bleeding edge everything. So I'm always curious about all of them. Who's got the time for it all, though? And sometimes it might take me a couple of years before I even start looking into something. But eventually, there are these different technologies that I will take some time to take a look at it. And inevitably, it's pretty confusing. There's all kinds of information, but maybe not information presented in exactly the way you need it that works for how your experience is or how you perceive things. And the confusion usually leads to an awful lot of frustration, right? And what I do is I walk away from it. I try not to walk upstairs to where all the potato chips and candy bars are. But maybe, go for a dog walk or something. But I walk away, I come back, I still can't do it. I walk away again. I take the dog for another walk, and I'm talking to the dog. Thank goodness I have the dog, because my neighbors would think I am a crazy lady because I'm talking out loud as I go up and down the road. But so often on those dog walks or on those bike rides or whatever, something loosens up, right? And you suddenly see the path through. Everybody familiar with that kind of moment of revelation? And once that hits, then we won, right? It's like it's all about us against the computer. It's all about winning. But it is such an amazing feeling when you've been so frustrated trying to learn something, and then all of a sudden, like, you got it. You're so excited about it. And I know that's coming after all these years of doing this and going through this cycle over and over again. Every time I hit this frustration, I know that joy is going to be coming. So it makes it worth going through that. Like, that's part of the process, the joy of pain. And you can always share your struggles, right, on social media. Everybody loves to hear those rants. And then usually my 7th step is I have to run out and tell everybody about, oh my God, this new thing, it's so cool, I just figured out. Might not even be new, just new to me, right? Because then there's people who are like, oh, that's so 2014. So this is another great expression of sometimes how it feels to learn, although I'm not quite sure if it's ever been this horrible for me. Has anybody ever used Drupal before? Is this about accurate? Pretty good? Anyway, so thank goodness it's not really always like that, but had to include that, right? So what I'm going to do as I share my tips and tricks, and really a lot of this is going to be about not only how I approach learning, but how I choose things and how deeply I choose to go. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to have these hitchhiker tips throughout this talk and then give some examples and some other ideas. So the first one of these, and this is actually an underlying theme through most of what I'm going to be talking about, is that when there is this new technology, sometimes it's really overwhelming to see like the whole big picture of it. But you don't have to be an expert in an entire technology in order to benefit from and even implement pieces of it, right? That doesn't make you a hack. You can really take advantage of maybe a small piece of a technology as you're in the process of learning it. And I do this all the time. Here is a technical example of that is testing. How many people here unit test, right? Unit test. How many people here do test-driven development, right? Not quite as many, right? So being a programmer from decades gone by, I've usually used to use the testing method of, I'd write some code, then I'd have to write some little UI with some buttons on it, right? To click on the buttons to test the code and maybe debug through the code. So, I started hearing about automated testing, and the way people were talking about it usually seemed like, oh, I don't know, it's really confusing. I don't know if I can do that. And then that talk evolved to, oh, well, you have to do test-driven development. Like, if you're not doing that, you can't call yourself a programmer. And by the way, if anybody ever says anything like that, just turn it around and walk away, because that person's a jerk. Believe me, I've heard plenty of that. So, the idea of TDD, test-driven development, when I didn't even understand testing, that was really a lot to take in, right? How could I start my development, my coding, by starting with tests if I didn't even understand the concept of testing? So I said to you people who said you have to do TDD, and I just started writing some automated tests for code that I already had, right? And then I could test that code and make sure it was working without having to write a little UI with the little stupid buttons that I was going to throw away anyway. And I used that, and I was benefiting from it. And if I was making changes to the code and there was regressions, the tests would let me know. So I wasn't I didn't understand the whole big end-to-end business of automated testing and test-driven development But I was really benefiting from it. And along the way, I started learning more about testing. I got comfortable with the concepts, comfortable enough to start looking into TDD, using it, implementing it, where it made sense, where it was helping me. So there's, I think, in my experience, a great example of learning a piece of something and still being able to implement it and benefit from it. Another topic, very overwhelming, to get your head wrapped around it. Once you're there, it's like, okay, is containers. Who's using Docker containers? Right. Wow, very impressed. So it took me a long time because everybody was talking about Docker and containers. And I used virtual machines. I had no idea how they worked. And God forbid something didn't go right. I was really without hope then. So that's the only kind of idea that I had of trying to comprehend Docker containers. But containers are not virtual machines at all. So it really took me quite some time to understand it. And I did do do a lot of .NET development. So there was like a .NET Core, ASP.NET Core walkthrough. And I did the walkthrough, and it had a Docker file in it. And I deployed the Docker file to a Docker container running locally on my machine. And I was able to access the API. I had no idea how it was working. But it was something. But then, I'm also a data person, not a DBA, but yeah, I really like data. And Microsoft came out with SQL Server for Linux, and they created a Docker image for it. I was like, now I'm going to start playing with it. So I downloaded the image onto my MacBook. Yes, I'm a Microsoft programmer with a MacBook. There's a lot of us now. It's all cross-platform cool stuff. I downloaded it, and I ran it, and I had been given a really good tip when I was trying to wrap my head around Git. Same thing. Oh my God, I had no clue about Git at first, and it took a while. But I had been advised, use the command line. Don't use the tools that mask all the stuff and do all the work for you. Use the command line so you can see what's going on. So that's what I did with Docker, right? I was listing my images and creating containers and naming them differently and copying them and shutting them down and seeing what was happening with my data and all kinds of stuff. So that was amazing. I mean, I'm still not, I know what Swarm is. I've heard of it. I think I can pronounce Kubernetes properly. I don't have that breadth of expertise, even though I've actually just become a Docker captain. I'm like, are you sure? And they wanted me because I'm helping other people get over that first hump also, right, of understanding Docker and then they can go to all those really super deep Docker captains and get the deep technical stuff. So they're, just another example of something to learn. And as I have thought more and more about this, I realize that in my life, this is how I've always approached things. Years ago, I was at a county fair, and they had a short climbing wall. Maybe it was like 30 feet or something like that. And I was like, I'm going to try that. By the way, I'm terrified of heights, and I have vertigo. So I'm going to challenge myself to try that. So I get strapped in. I start going up, and I'm like, oh, shit, I'm going to have to go down. Down was a lot scarier to me than up. So I ended up getting to the top because I was avoiding the downward trip as long as I could. Eventually, I had to go down. But after that, I was like, hey, that was pretty cool, and I could do it. So I started going to a rock climbing gym. And what I did when I first got there was, got strapped up. I went up, I don't know, 10 feet, 12 feet. And that was all my heart could handle. That was it. I was like, okay, well, that was cool. I found a climbing wall, even though there was so much more to go. Then, I went home. That was it. Next time I went there, I was like, okay, I got to that point, so I know I can do that. So what I'm going to do today is I'm going to get there, because, that's already something I know how to do. And I'm going to see how much further I can go. And over weeks, right, getting further, going out, doing this, doing that. It's a very similar approach to how I learn things in life that I've just naturally applied to how I've learned technology. So climbing, so I never actually ended up going out onto the real rocks. And the funniest to me, part of that was I ended up marrying a rock climber, but by the time we were dating, he was finished with his rock climbing. So I was long over it anyway. But that was a pretty scary thing, right? So new things like climbing up on rocks or new technologies that can definitely be daunting and scary to approach. And this is how, we are in the UK. People must be familiar with the Vicar of Dibley and this guy, Jim, who this is all, he always talks, it's like more like a stutter that he has. He always goes, no, 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 yes, whenever he means to answer yes. He always starts with no. This is often my answer to, Julie, you should try this technology or that technology. I'm always like, push back, because I'm like, no, I can't take another. I've got to learn so much stuff. It's so hard. And I'm going to feel like an idiot for a while. But, you know, I definitely do that. Visual Studio Code. That was a good one for me. And as a matter of fact, I started Visual Studio Code because I decided, I'm a .NET developer, I decided I was going to write a Node.js API, right? Because, you know, I'd been hearing about them so much. I am not a JavaScript developer, okay? So I was just like, right into the deep end. My friends were laughing at me. They're like, you're supposed to learn things first. I'm like, no, I just want to do it. How hard could it be, right? I write APIs in .NET and C#. Anyway, yeah, it was hard. I had to learn so many things. And, you know, just some different paradigms about JavaScript programming, you know, because it was kind of originally a client-side language, not back-end, you know, and learning. I had to learn Express.js. I had to learn all these different things. Then I'm trying to run this thing, and I realize I don't know how to debug it, right? I can't remember what I was coding it in, but not in VS Code. It had Visual Studio Code actually had just come out into preview or something like that. So I'm .NET, Visual Studio. I've had so many great tools, and Visual Studio has an amazing debugger in it. I'm like, I'm used to doing that. I want a debugger. So I did a little research and saw, there's a Node.js extension for Visual Studio. I'll try that. So I install the extension. I try to open up my little project, and it takes 20 minutes to open up the project. And I'm like, this is not going to work. So, of course, I get onto Twitter. I'm like, oh, my God, blah, blah, blah. And all these people are like, oh, you should use Visual Studio Code. And my immediate response was this, like, no, I've just had to learn too many things. I can't take another thing. No, no, no. And then I'm like, all right, I'll take a look at it. Right? So I download it. It downloads in like 3 seconds. And within about 5 minutes, I was debugging Node. Like, oh, okay, right? But I always go through this no matter what. My husband says, I just don't like being told what to do, right? If somebody tells me, oh, you should do this, I'm like, don't tell me what to do. And I'm like, okay, I'll try it. So, you know, sometimes you just got to buckle in and go for it. So another non-technical example. And this is kind of a different perspective. So I live in Vermont. It's a tiny little state with a lot of very big hills. As a matter of fact, there really aren't any, except when you get down to the lake. There's no flat roads. Everything is like this and this, really steep. You're always going up and downhill. 3 miles from my house is the steepest road there is. It goes up to what's called the App Gap, the Appalachian Gap. And there it is. So the App Gap is like the biggest challenge for road cyclers around. Although I have neighbors, we call them the Energizer Bunnies, and they like come home from work and they just ride up it and ride back down. But for me, I've always looked at that and gone, I could never do that, right? That wasn't fear. That was just like a joke. Like, I could never possibly do that. One day, I was like, you know, I'm curious, how far up this hill can I get, right? Not, I'm going to try to get to the top. But just, you know, I'm curious how far I can get. Because however far I get, it's a win, right? Unless I, you know, get like 3 feet and then I'm done. So this is actually a cool website because it can show you the elevations down here. So that's like the beginning. Is it? Wait a minute. Do you see the little blue dot? Oh, it's not happening. Oh, you know, maybe I'm still in presenter mode. Anyway, so I get up to about where, oh, a little before that hook, right? That little hook there. I'll get a little up to there. And I'm already getting into like 16, 17% grades. And there's this relentless mile of like this. And I'm going up and up and up. And I get to a point where like, there's no way I can go any further. I have to turn around and go home. But instead of being like, oh, I didn't get to the top, I was like, holy moly, I cannot believe I got here. This was amazing to get up this far. So I go home. I go again. The next time I go up, I get to the same spot, and my body is just like, no. But it's also my mind going, oh, I can't go any further. I mean, there's a point when you're going so slow, you can't even like hold your bike up anymore. You're going to fall over. So I was closing in on that. So I was like, oh, I'm gonna go home. So then about a week after that, we were driving over the mountain. And I was paying really close attention to all the different elevations, right? And I noticed that right past the hook, and actually where I had stopped, it goes back this way. That's actually really steep, this little thing right here. But then right when you get to about where that 2 is, it levels out. And when I say levels out, I mean it gets into 6% and 7% grade as opposed to 12% and 19% grade. And I'm like, oh, if I could just get there, right? So I'm like learning the lay of the land in a different way than I'd ever understood it before. So the next time I went, I got to that point where, you know, my point of turnaround usually, I'm like, I know all I have to do is get past this little thing and then I get a break. And I did. Just having that knowledge gave me somehow the power to push through it and get past it. And, oh! What was that? Oh, it was everybody who's done it. Oh, command, that's why. OK, I think you're always on the slide. I've got a little transition problem here on my computer. OK, so the point of that story is not that, like, oh, I'm like some amazing bicycler, because I'm not. Believe me, the next time I went up and over, everybody was, all these bike racers, they're just flying by me. But I'm like, I'm still here, going up the hill. But the fact that I had learned the lay of the land of that ride and had a general understanding of the whole topic that was getting up that mountain, it really gave me a lot more power, even if I was just doing a little at a time, and incrementing how far I was getting up that mountain, right? And that also aligns so much with part of how I learn. So even though, like with test-driven, the whole testing thing, or even the Docker thing, right? I understand Kubernetes is out there. I understand swarms. You know, I understand what they're for. And right now, I don't even have a need to learn them. But I do get the big picture, even if I'm only really good at a small piece of it, and still benefiting from it. And still have, even with that small piece, have enough credibility that Docker made me a Docker captain, right? Who knew? OK, more technical, all right? Is anybody familiar with this book that I'm holding? How is that for like a little bit of photoshopping there, getting Eric Evans' book in there? So that's Eric Evans' book, Domain-Driven Design. By the way, I want to mention, for any DDD fans, there's, if you're not familiar, DDDX is in a couple weeks right here in London. If you know, don't know about that. So I do actually a lot of writing and speaking and coaching on domain-driven design, because you know, I work with a lot of clients and help them with architecture, and that is really a passion of mine that I really only came to maybe in about the last 8 years. The book's, you know, last 8 of my 30, right? And that book's been around since 2003. So it took me a little while to come to it, but I'm definitely quite enamored of domain-driven design. One of the most important concepts in DDD is called the bounded context. Okay? The bounded context gives you the ability to look at a big, messy problem and break it down into small, individual problems that are each on their own solvable problems. And then there's also patterns in DDD for interconnecting them. But you don't have to worry about those, right? The patterns exist. You can just focus on one thing at a time. And Simon was talking about that kind of same concept this morning when he was talking about think small, right? Think small, and he was talking about breaking up his maps. The way he uses his maps is different than the way you do domain modeling, but there's still some alignment in thinking and benefits there. And it aligns very much, again, with this whole concept of how I approach life, right? How I approach the problem of climbing up a climbing wall, or how I approach the problem of, oh my God, somebody's coming for dinner and I have to cook the dinner and I have to walk the dog, and oh my God, the house is a mess, and all of that, and, right? And I just go, all right, I'm going to just deal with one problem at a time and solve that and not stress out, because it's so stressful to think about all those problems at once. So DDD, like especially bounded context, there's two layers here, right? One is how much the idea of bounded context aligns with this approach to how to deal with so much technology coming at you. Don't be overwhelmed by all of it. Just pick something and focus on it, solve that problem, move on to the next. All right? So this is for modeling domains, so modeling business problems. And so I adopted the concept, just that overall concept of how to find the boundaries between the different problems and create smaller problems. Creating problems doesn't sound like a very good thing. Breaking big problems down into smaller problems so that I could solve them, right? But that is only just a piece of bounded context. This is everything that's inside of the bounded context. I ignored all that at first. I just took advantage of the overall concept and was already benefiting from it. My clients were already benefiting from it because I was helping them identify boundaries and find saner ways to approach their business problems instead of going, but this is connected to that, and that is to this, and oh my God, what am I going to do, right? And I'm always like, just calm down. It's okay. We're just going to focus on this right now, right? But then little by little, I started, taking on another piece of a bounded context and, building up my understanding and being able to leverage that and do things, kind of taking advantage of these patterns and these guidance. Now, bounded context is only a small part of all of DDD, right? But, that was where I started, and I got really good at that. And then because I had been doing that and thinking about it and talking to people about it, I was able to, evolve my understanding into other areas, and just my benefit got bigger and bigger and bigger. But, going back to the first Hitchhiker Tip, I learned this one thing. I truly benefited from it, right, without being an expert, a DDD expert of the whole kit and caboodle, and have been growing my expertise into different areas of DDD and continuously benefiting from it. So, now what I'm going to do is, we've got like about 10 minutes left. I've got a whole slew of other tips, but I'm going to go through them a little more quickly. So the first one is not to be afraid to explore stuff, right? Things you're curious about. Now, I know not everybody has the time to just go and chase every idea that you're interested in. People have 9-to-5 jobs or 8 to 6. They have kids at home. Those are important things. Spend time with your family, et cetera. But if you see something that intrigues you, go take a look at it. Go play with it. I do this all the time. Now, I used to blog a lot. I always say that Twitter ate my blog because I just tweet little ideas all the time. But now I also have other ways to vent my need to write. I've written some books, but since about 2010, I've been writing a monthly column in MSDN magazine called Data Points. My editor totally trusts me. As long as there's some data connection in there, I can write about whatever I want. Right? And you'll see here, remember I mentioned that somebody said, I was having a hard time understanding Git, And I was out with some geeks one night, and I said, we were talking about that. I was like, it's so confusing to me. And he said, Julie, you're a data geek. It's just data. It's just data about changes to your code. And I was like, what? Wait, what are you talking about? This is the same person who said, use the command line so what's going on isn't masked from you, because I need to understand what my tools are doing, right? And that helps a lot. So, I said, I'm just going to chase that down and use it as an idea for an article, right? So, but the article was my goal, right? It wasn't something at work. For this, it was just something I was curious about. So this is just kind of a smattering of different things. Knockout.js. So I'm not a JavaScript programmer, but I do, dive into there every once in a while. Oh my gosh, I used Aurelia, right? The client-side JavaScript framework, because I tied it into data binding, because you got to get data in and out. BDD, another DD thing. Behavior-driven design with SpecFlow. Somebody demoed something about SpecFlow once at a user group. I was like, oh, that's cool, right? So I just made an excuse to play with it, right? Now, I have this understanding of all this smattering things. I've never used BDD or SpecFlow since, but if I need to, or maybe I'm having a conversation with somebody and they're talking about some challenge they're trying to solve. Now, I know enough to be able to identify when BDD or SpecFlow might be able to help them, right? So I have that knowledge. But I have fun, playing with these different things, whether they become a thing for me or not. Look, see, Node.js, right? I tied it into document databases. So sometimes when you chase those dreams, it's a little like that, like, oh, maybe that wasn't such a good idea. So, whatever, right? Fail fast, right? Be happy to walk away from it pretty quickly. Now, this is a little more random. This is something somebody tweeted a photo from a conference with that quote from somebody else's slide. I was like, oh, that is such a good thing to share with everybody anytime I talk anywhere. I went to try to find, it was a photo, it wasn't searchable. I could never figure out who had tweeted it, what conference it was, or source the person who originally made this quote. So I at least put it in quotation. Somebody somewhere said this. And this is something I have a hard time with, right? I've got all this street cred out there in Twitterland or whatever, as a technology person, but I'm still afraid to ask questions, because that's going to be the day somebody's like, oh, she's so stupid, right? Like, we all have that fear, right? So I'll spend 2 or 3 days going around in circles with something before I finally just give it an ask, and then somebody be like, oh, it's just this. I'm like, why did I waste all that time, right? And nobody, by the way, said, oh my God, did you see Julie Lerman ask that question? I never realized how stupid she was, right? That didn't happen. So don't be afraid. It is not a sign of failure. And then even though this whole time I've been talking about learn small things, don't worry about big pictures, while you're at a conference, this is the time to let it, as some of you might be familiar with Scott Hanselman, as he says, let it all wash over you, right? Go to topics that you're just like, I've always wondered about that, or I have no idea what that is, but the abstract sounds interesting, right? Or just randomly pick something and just soak in information, because you never know. Like, some of it might one day just like perk up in your head and go, that thing, that was really interesting. I think I'm going to look a little more into it. Or you might be having a meeting with your team and somebody's talking about a problem, and you can be a hero and say, oh, well, I think you should use, X to solve that, and hope that you've got enough time to run over to Google before they ask you any more about it, right? But you've got the idea. So this is a good time to just go for general, like, just soak in all this different kind of knowledge. So just to sum up, I said the theme really was about targeting these narrow skills, these individual things, because you can still totally benefit from them. You can, even if it's not the whole thing, there are pieces that you can implement on their own, right? And then grow those skills And then hopefully somebody has read this book and you understand what I did there with that repeat 42 times. 42 is the answer to the world. Yeah, OK. All right, so that's it. Oh, also, Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. Don't panic. Whatever you do, don't panic. And that's it. Thank you very much. Thanks for your time.